perfect segue for our next topic, which is pivot. We're talking about how to listen, how to look, and how to know when to act when you need to make a change. And Kim, you're like the poster child for that, right? So, we were talking, had a little panelist meeting yesterday where we were talking about the companies that were so iconic not that long ago, and they're no longer here. We were talking about Kodak. Everybody remember Kodak? And, they were the world leaders in film and camera and all of that, and then all of a sudden they just made a conscious choice not to go to digital, and they were gone. Kmart, we talked about that this morning, gone. Borders and Books, all of the bookstores. It's tragic, right? Who knew that people would prefer this little digital device called a Kindle? So all of these companies, they were just the ashes of change, basically. And they didn't react, or they couldn't react fast enough, or they weren't looking ahead at the trends. And that's what we're here to talk about today with the three companies that we have with us. So I'd like to first just introduce the names and the companies, and then we're going to let them kind of self-introduce. So we have Dan O'Connell, and Dan is with H-New Photonics and H-New Energy. And then we have Gary Greenberg. He is with Edge 3D, and Sumner Erdman with Ulupalakua Ranch. So why don't we start with you on that side, Sumner, and you can just give them a 1 or 2 minute description of what Ulupalakua Ranch is.
Pain in the butt? No. Anyway, glad to be here, and thank you all for coming. Ulupalakua Ranch, as most of you know, is a cattle ranch on the southwest slopes of Haleakala, or the island of Maui. And we generally raise cattle, which was the core business in 1963. But since that time, we now also raise elk and sheep. We harvest axis deer, which we sell in our store in burgers, as in lamb burgers, elk burgers, venison burgers, beef burgers. We do telecommunications leases. We have a wind farm that we lease to. We've also diversified, my father diversified into what is now Maui Winery. And we've diversified outside of the state of Hawaii as well into other farms and farming in both Oregon and New Zealand.
All right, thank you, Sumner. Gary, why don't we hear about your business?
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I just realized I moved to Maui 14 years ago, and 10 days from now it'll be 14 years. I came here to retire. That didn't go so well, to tell you the truth. I came with me and my microscope, and I noticed there was a lot of sand around, and I'd say a lot of pictures of sand and flowers. Did a little teaching at Kamehameha schools, and I got a little antsy and started inventing microscopes again. So I have this company called Edge 3D, and we make unique three-dimensional microscopes. Now you wonder why three-dimensional? Well, the problem is with microscopes, traditionally, is they've been two-dimensional, and they only see a very small depth of field. You just see a little bit that's in focus, and it's all 2D. So as a result, there's a lot of problems with misdiagnosis and so forth through a microscope. So I've been inventing microscopes that are three-dimensional, that have a very large depth of field, so you see the whole thing in focus. And it's used in industry and medicine, biomedicine, and so forth. So I'll tell you more about it as we move on.
Great, thank you. And Dan?
Hi, glad to be here. My name is Dan O'Connell. I came to Maui in 1989 to windsurf. I should have applied for a job at High Tech, I think. But seriously, I came here to work at the observatories on Haleakala and I worked there for 15 years building scientific instruments for space observations. And after that, I wanted to do something different, so I founded what is now a family of companies I refer to as H-Nu. H-Nu is the energy of light. Nu is the frequency of light. And all those wonderful things that you saw that can be done with waves, light is a wave. And there's so much that can be done with light waves. It can be used in energy, medicine, photonics. Today I'm going to talk about a couple of the companies that we started, H-Nu Photonics and H-Nu Energy.
Okay, thank you all. So we're going to hear about, from each of you, about your story of how your company had to pivot at a certain point. I think in the life of every company, you will find a point at which you're going to have to shift direction, or you're going to have to reinvent yourself. And today is how to, first of all, what happened in their companies, and then how did they know it was happening? How did they foresee it, and then how it's kind of working out for them for this shift. And then they're going to give you a few nuggets of wisdom that you can take home with you. So let's say, Gary, why don't we start with you, Gary? Just tell us about your story of how you just happened to pivot in your microscope business.
Well, thank you. I've reinvented myself several times, actually. So I'm fairly old, so I've gone through this process several times. I'm an LA guy, so I went to UCLA, and I got a degree in psychology and a minor in art. And I graduated, and I knew I didn't want to become a psychologist. So I got very fascinated with photography. And I became a partner in a multimedia company in Venice, California during the 70s. And we made films and slides and videotapes of art and architecture and environment. And in the end, I got really interested in science, which I've always been interested in. I got a number of jobs going around the world taking pictures of living cells through microscopes, doing movies, time-lapse movies of living cells through microscopes. And I got fascinated with biology. I would ask these professors, well, what's that little thing moving around? And they said, well, we don't really know. I said, well, how does it move around? They said, well, we don't really know. I thought, this is for me. This is a good idea, something I'd like to get into. So I got the opportunity. I was working in London for quite a while for a professor at University College, and I got the opportunity to do a PhD in developmental biology, which is how does a organism go from an egg and a sperm to an old guy like me? What are all the changes that happen? And it's a pretty fascinating series of changes, and it's the interaction between DNA and the environment. That's basically what it's all about. So I got this PhD, and then I went to the University of Southern California and was an assistant professor there, working on research. I was in this particular time working on chick embryos to see what the problems were with certain types of birth defects like spina bifida. And so I was looking at these developing chick embryos, and it was really hard to see anything of any clarity. And I just bought the most expensive Zeiss microscope I could get, and still you could barely see anything. And I realized, I got to start looking at this in a different way. And I brought my knowledge of photography to microscopes. So I knew as a photographer, let me back up for just 1 second. A microscope traditionally lights the scene with one light, either straight up or straight down. And as a photographer, you would never do that. A photographer would never have just one light straight onto a subject. You'd use key light, fill light, backlight, a little spotlight to pull out what you really want. So I started lighting a microscope like a good photographer would do that. And the results were immediate and quite spectacular and dramatic. What I was able to do, just by changing the lighting and putting multiple lights on microscopes from different angles, I was able to create highlights and shadows, increase the resolution and the contrast, so you now could begin to see what was happening in these chick embryos, and I was doing time-lapse movies of them. All of a sudden, I could see deeper into the specimen. And one of the side effects of doing this sort of what's called multiple oblique illumination was you got 3D as well. So not only did you get the increase of resolution and depth of field and contrast, but it gave you real-time 3D, so you could actually see the object developing in 3D. So I, at that time, made another major change in my life. It was to resign from USC, find investors, and start a microscope company. And this was in Santa Monica, California. And I was very fortunate to get some very deep pocket investment. And we made some really interesting microscopes. I developed 5 different products over a period of the years and sold them to industry and research and so forth. And then the dot-com crash came and the bottom of the market kind of fell out and confocal microscopes were coming in, and that's when I decided to sort of get out of the business. Then I moved here and we're back to my beginning of my story. But the point I want to make is that what led me to my original inventions on microscopes was using knowledge that I had in another field, knowledge of photography, and using it to apply to microscopes and science and technology. So that was a big, important lesson for me, and I still do that. I would encourage you to do that as well, to take lessons that you've learned in other parts of your life and see how it applies to the businesses that you're in. I don't know how much time I should.
That's good for now.
That's good for now.
Yeah, we'll come back to you for sure. So Sumner, why don't you tell us next about Ulupalakua's pivot story? We know that it's happened several times on the ranch, but we'll focus on maybe 1 or 2 today. So.
Actually, I'm gonna diverge a little from what we talked about because I did think about it a little bit more last night. I think the biggest pivot moment for me was maybe about 10 years ago when I realized, even though we had done a lot of diversification and everything else, I had to go through the mental pivotal change and realize that while we were a cattle ranching company, we were no longer a cattle ranching company. We were a company that happened to raise cattle so that we could make other changes and not be focused on one soul and make that the only driving force, and that you could mentally change those things. You could mentally look at putting in wind towers and realize you had to adapt your cattle ranching during the construction of the wind farm and all during that time. And I think we've all heard the fight between cattle ranchers and sheep farmers years ago. And you have to get over that, and you have to get your employees over that. And I think that was the biggest pivotal change for me, because it allowed me to go and explain why we were doing things, why we were moving in new directions, and to look in a lot newer directions than we were previously. Even though we had made a lot of changes, we really needed to make that pivotal change in our brain. And I think that's the most important thing you have to do when you're doing it, is to decide that you want to go from looking at embryos to making the microscope, to, going from selling surfboards to kiteboards. You have to make that mental change in your head first and foremost. And so for me, it was about 10 years ago. And it was really probably frustration within my own self and having to get out of that. I was born cattle ranching. That's what I did. But I had to make a mental change that I just happen to run a company that raises cattle, but we do a bunch of other things.
That's a really good point. Dan, let's hear H-News' story of pivot.
Yes, we've also had a number of pivots over the years, and H-New Photonics was founded for 2 main purposes. One was to develop precision optical instruments, and the other was just a minor goal, was to solve the world's energy problem. So just a minor goal. And we were taking a different approach. We wanted to use light to generate more energy than solar panels were producing. And so we had a lab, and we were testing out different ways of collecting light and focusing it onto very small chips. And those chips had multi-layers, and they would generate 40%, convert 40% of the sunlight into usable energy. That was more than double what the conventional solar panels were. And then when we put it together as a panel, it was about 32% total efficiency of the system. So we had twice the amount of energy, and also know that solar, sun doesn't shine at night, and even when it does shine, there's clouds, and so it's variable. So we knew we had to stabilize it. So we engineered an energy storage solution to go with it, and we had received patents on our solar panels, and we were ready to go to market. And at that time, the price of silicon had dropped by more than 50%, and the price of our panels, we could no longer compete. And so we had to make a decision: do we give up this technology, or do we do something with that? And so we decided we were going to create a company, H New Energy, that would design, engineer, and install solar systems. And as today, we have installed some of the largest solar systems around the islands. We work on all the islands. But we didn't give up on the energy storage. Over the years, we've built the largest battery on Maui, which is located at Ulupalakua Ranch. We had done that for another company. We designed and built it. And we realized that once the grid hits a certain level of saturation, once there's a certain amount of solar on the grid, batteries are going to be needed. And we saw that coming. We knew that would happen. We continued to work on our battery technology. And sure enough, 2015, the net metering program ended in Hawaii because it had reached a certain level of grid saturation, and that makes the grid unstable, so you need energy storage to stabilize the grid to keep going. And so we launched a product and created a new company called Hive Energy Systems. And last year we were the terawatt sponsor at the Maui Energy Expo and launched our product. Now all of our solar systems have our own product as part of the solar system. So, there was a couple of pivots. H-No Photonics is still manufacturing precision optical instruments. H-No Energy is installing solar energy. And now with our battery product, we're able to achieve, approach our goal of helping really achieve, and now our state is the first in the country to mandate 100% renewable, and that requires energy storage along with the wind and solar and hydroelectric and other things. And so those are areas that we were willing and ready to change. We saw a change was needed, and as a company, we were flexible and applied the technologies and the effort done in one area and applied it to another. A lot like what Gary is saying, he took his expertise in photography and created a remarkable microscope imaging capability in 3 dimensions.
Well, thank you so much for that. So we talked yesterday when we had our little meeting about how you all came to these conclusions that there was going to be a shift. There was going to be some pivoting that needed to be done. But you all came to it in different ways. And so we talked about, is it financial? Is it trends? Is it, there's so many ways that business owners can determine. So Sumner, you had some really good insight on that. Tell us about how, what is it that led you to this new shift?
Obviously, there's always economics, and that's always there. And you have to be looking out at it in what's out in front of you and how that's going to affect you in 5 or 10 years. And do realize this, if you start looking at it when your balance sheet's starting to hurt, you're too late. You need to be looking at it all the way out. And it's pretty easy to do that in agriculture. I grew up in a world of agriculture in Hawaii that was rapidly changing. We've lost 250,000 acres of agriculture in the state of Hawaii in 20 years. So I know it's a challenge, and it's easy to go and look at. So that makes it easy to change. Opportunity is one thing you can always look at to see. Telecommunications, cellular telephone sites, radio communications. We have, because we're on the Southwest Rift, we're an ideal place for it, which is one part of the opportunity. The other part of the opportunity is most people don't want those things in their backyard. I don't mind them in my backyard, so it works. Also the opportunity of changing energy conditions. The wind farm, and we have a very windy place. There's also the opportunity of changing dietary needs and what everybody else wants to do. That's why we got into raising elk. It's a high protein, lower fat product. We're always looking at those kind of things. Then there's the necessity of other changes that you're forced into. When I came back 30 years ago, we raised sheep. I couldn't find the economic value in doing that. I got rid of them. And then we've had climate change, and we've watched grasses change. We've watched the Mediterranean kikuyu grass, which dominated our grass to 1,000 feet in elevation, move up, and you can't find it below 2,000 feet today. And even at that level, it's getting weak. The tropical bunch grasses are moving up the mountain, but not as quickly as the kikuyu grass is. So what you see in Ulupalakua today are a bunch of weeds. Now I can buy a lot of herbicide, or I can go get back in the sheep market, which is what I did. And why I got back in the sheep market, then I had to find a market. We started making lamb burgers and a few things. And we don't actually do the sheep as an economic enterprise, but as an economic way not to have to pay for something that you can't get your money back out of in herbicides. So there are different opportunities and different reasons to do it. I was fortunate enough, the concept of change was drilled into me from my dad. He was always adapting and doing those things, but over the years, I've personally found new ways to do those things, and the opportunities were there and why you would change.
Great. And Dan, what led you? I mean, you were obviously looking at trends in energy, and you were looking at the marketplace, you know, what was happening with the net metering and so forth. So what ultimately led you, and how did you keep your eye on those things?
Well, there's a number of things that are important. One is, as Sumner said, is opportunity, but recognizing opportunity. One thing that can be discouraging is failure. Failure is not the end. Failure can be an opportunity, but you have to have the right perspective to acknowledge it and see that what an opportunity is in front of you. So having a perspective, knowing, being aware of the market. I think key thing is intuition. If you don't have it, it's very good to surround yourself with a team, people that have intuition, but you have to test your ideas constantly, because you can't build it and assume they will come. It doesn't always work. So intuition is good, to look forward, be flexible, and be able to recognize an opportunity when you're faced with it. And sometimes it's when you're faced with a challenge. And I think whiteboard is a very good, powerful tool, as you put your challenge on that whiteboard and circle it, and you get a team together and you draw lines from that box of what are all your options are, and then that challenge turns into ideas, turns into paths forward, many paths forward, and it's no longer a challenge anymore. And so it's having that readiness to change, willingness, and perspective.
And Gary, you said yours was almost instantaneous. It was like your moment, right?
Well, some of my moments for change were because of discovering things. And when that happens, there's sort of aha moments, and all of a sudden, you discover something new, and then you do the hard work to make it a reality. But those moments, those are momentary times. But what really led to the change in my current business was really the environment had totally changed. When I was making my first microscopes, they were all analog, and it was basically lights and lenses. But then about the year 2000 or around that time, the microscope industry completely changed because of three really important things. Robotics, computers, and lasers completely changed how microscopes are made. And expensive microscopes are made using really high-tech sorts of equipment, and you can see things you've never been able to see before. In the year 2000, microscopes got to the point that they could see individual atoms, one individual atom. That's how good they got, because of robotics, lasers, and computers. So when I moved here at that time, just a little bit after that, and got sort of the bug of wanting to make microscopes again, I realized that the technology has totally changed, and I had to incorporate lasers and computers and technology in order to really meet the needs of what microscopes were becoming. So that was really the impetus of the current Edge microscope, which is heavily computer-based. There was a lot of computer code to write to make this thing work in 3D. Robotics is an incredibly important part of microscopes today. Lasers have become instrumental. So it really was the technological environment that had changed that really led to the recent Edge iteration.
Great, thank you. So let's talk about, in our last segment here, let's talk about where are you today? And then what are those little nuggets of wisdom that you can leave these wonderful attendees we have here today for their businesses, and what they might apply to their businesses, and what to watch for, and how to watch for that. Sumner, yeah, we'll go with Sumner.
I think some of those nuggets that we talked about, surprisingly, we've all brought up already earlier. We forgot to save them. And mine was, if you're looking at the balance sheet and realizing you have to change that, it's too late. Make sure you're constantly looking ahead all the way through, and look for opportunities where they're at. I think that's really, look for those opportunities and look for ways to solve problems. Sheep, axis venison burgers, instead of axis deer being a problem and eating all the grass. Look for all those opportunities and how to solve problems. Where we're at today, we're struggling to keep moving ahead and look for the next new thing. We're playing with some ideas. We're challenged by different things, and we have to watch that. We have very rocky, slopey conditions, so there's a lot of things we can't do. Communications towers are easy to do. But farming's tough to do. We're water challenged. So we are looking for what's next. We're looking at other energy type things and batteries and conversions. I'm actually surprised at how, in the conversation yesterday and today, how the three of us come from completely different industries or businesses, but there's a lot of commonality in there. But I'm watching our time, so.
Yeah. And Dan, you want to speak to that? Where you are today, and what kind of wisdom can you impart to these folks with business?
Well, I would say passion is all about passion, and it's really important to love what you do and be excited about it every day. And even if it's difficult or challenging, rise above that, and be excited you have to be relentless. You can never give up. And I went to a conference with NASA. We were working on a project, and Elon Musk gave a talk, and it was about 2 years ago. One of the SpaceX rockets was launching a few $100 million satellite into space, and it had blown up on the launch pad, and it was on his birthday. And so the conference was a week later, and they asked him, he was speaking, and they asked him, "What are you going to do now?" And he said, "I'm never going to launch on my birthday again." So, it's perspective and being relentless. He didn't give up, and some things that seem very basic, like time management, are really, really critical. If you have really difficult goals ahead, you have 10 things that you have to do to get there. It's really knowing how much time to spend on each one in order to meet that end goal. And it's looking ahead, not only in the market, but how are you going to reach your near-term goals, keeping track of time. And I think that the idea of the whiteboard, writing down your to-do list daily, checking it off, that enables you to manage a lot more. It just trains your brain to be able to extract it, and you don't have to think and remember it. It's written down. It changes it. It really changes how much you can accomplish in a given day, and surrounding yourselves with like-minded people. So when there's change that the company has to make, you're all willing to change together, because it's not what you're doing necessarily, it's who you are as a company. And if you have like-minded people that have diverse opinions, but you have like-minded, you're willing to change, and you won't be at odds, and you won't have diversity. Where we are today, we're a lot closer to our original goals by making changes. And it seems at the time like it's a diversion, but it really isn't. It's like water flowing down a river. If there's a rock in the way, it flows around it, but it still ends up in the same place in the end.
Right. Great advice, Dan. Thank you. Gary, so how are things ending up? And I'm sure you're maybe looking at your next thing, but what wisdom would you share with the crowd?
Well, I am looking at the next thing. So with this microscope has been developing and getting into other areas and expanding into areas we didn't think it would go into, which is quite interesting. And I think one of the two important things I'd like to say, it's one thing to have ideas, it's another thing to be able to do something successful with it. And that requires working with other smart, talented, motivated people. That's like really important. Because today, you can't do it all yourself, especially in technology, probably in any area. You really need to depend on talented people that can work together, that are self-motivated. And as an example, on my microscope, there's a lot of computer coding involved. Well, I'm not a computer coder, so you have to work with people who are able to do that. There's a lot of engineering involved. One of the things I've learned is the value of strategic alliances with other companies. Dan and I are doing a strategic alliance with their microscope stuff and the Edge microscope stuff. That's good for both companies. That's something that you might want to look into. That's always, not always, can often be really good. The thing I'd like to leave you with, sort of the example of how I used photography to invent a new type of a microscope. There's probably something in all of your lives. Maybe you were in sports in high school. Maybe you're a musician. Maybe you're a writer. What are the lessons you've learned with that kind of deep dive into the experience of life that you've had? How can you apply that to your business? And I think you might find some interesting solutions just by looking within your own experience.
Well, those are all great, and I would say that one thing that you did today is, you got yourself out of your businesses, you came to a conference, you're opening your mind to some new thoughts, new ideas, you're looking at your business from a different perspective. I think that we all need to be lifelong learners. We need to study our trade magazines. We talked about that. Every trade has some kind of an industry magazine or multiple. So those are important. And then getting yourself off island as well, and getting off to conferences that are within your trade possibly, just so you can see what's coming and what is the next thing on the horizon. And it really opens your mind a lot. That was really valuable. All the years that we had our business, we tried to get ourselves off island and see what the rest of the world is doing, because sometimes we get a little, sequestered here. We've got about a couple minutes. Is there a question or two? We have maybe time for 2 questions. Sir?
The topic of pivot is sort of related to improvising. And I wonder, is this something, you kind of talked about how you developed it, but is it something you can cultivate as an art form? I mean, I know they're doing improv as a tool of leadership. Is it something that you see that could be learned, or is it just the hard work of...
I'll definitely take that one. It definitely can be learned. In my case, it was learned. My father got into sheep and started doing that change, and I was brought up in that, so it can definitely be learned.
Another question? Any others? Did you want to, any of you want to, oh, we have one here, okay.
All cowboys. And yes, change is difficult. We talked about culture of change a little bit yesterday. We had a lot more time yesterday than we do today. I have found some resistance, and there is change, and you have to definitely manage through that. But it can be done as long as it's explained properly, which sort of goes back to that other question.
Dan, you want to talk about how you find employees in your very specific technical business?
Yeah, there's 2 ways. I think the most interesting has been a very organic growth, and where we don't plan it. And people come to us, and it's about the person and what the person is about, what they bring, what skills they have. And we look at how can that person fit in this organization and contribute, and how can we grow with that person and that mindset. And it's very different than putting advertising and looking for a specific job. We do that too, but I think the majority of our hiring has been more organic.
Well, very good. I think that's the end of our time. So thank you, panelists. Thank you so much.